Nolan Briggs paid $17,400 for a dead gas station in the Nevada desert and told himself that was enough. A place to work, a place to sleep, a roof that belonged to him and his daughter. But on the very first night, 12 black SUVs with no plates rolled out of the dark and stopped in front of the dead fuel columns. A woman stepped out and called it Station 7, demanding the keys to a vault Nolan had never known existed beneath his feet. When he refused, no one drew a weapon. A lawyer opened a briefcase instead and slid across an offer worth $50 million. There is a kind of silence that only the Nevada desert can produce, not the silence of a room with the lights off, but something older and drier, the kind that fills the space between a man and the enormity of his own choices. Nolan Briggs had learned to live inside that silence after his wife died 3 years earlier, leaving him with a 13-year-old daughter named Mara, a Las Vegas apartment full of memories he could not outrun, and a set of industrial maintenance skills that paid the bills but fed nothing deeper. He had spent 18 years troubleshooting energy systems, generators, grid relays, pipeline valves, and he was good at it in the way working-class technical people often are, methodical and precise, capable of reading a broken machine the way other men read faces. He sold the apartment, drove northeast, and found the Mile 7 listing in a county auctioned. Former fuel distribution point, structure present, infrastructure status unknown, offered for outstanding tax balance. He walked the property for 2 hours after arriving and decided the silence felt like possibility rather than defeat. The first inspection revealed ordinary decay, peeling paint on the canopy, a cracked cashier window, 2 of the 6 fuel columns corroded to the point of no return. He cataloged the damage systematically and built a working budget in his head. 2 replacement pump mechanisms, new electrical breakers, a temporary sleeping space carved from the back storage room, and enough material to patch the service bay where he planned to run a roadside recovery operation. The nearest interstate off-ramp was 11 miles east, and while the old highway running past Mile 7 had been bypassed by a 4-lane build in the 1990s, the occasional long-haul driver still used it to avoid way stations, which meant there was a trickle of stranded vehicle business to be earned. Nolan was not a man who needed a crowd. He needed a project and a purpose, and a place where Mara could visit on school breaks without feeling the weight of a city that had swallowed her mother. He called his daughter that first evening and told her the place was ugly but honest, and she laughed and said, that sounded exactly like him. The anomalies appeared as he worked deeper into the infrastructure, and Nolan noticed them the way any experienced technician notices things that do not belong in their context. Not with alarm, but with the quiet alertness of a person whose job has always been to understand why a system is behaving in an unexpected way. The electrical conduit running beneath the service bay was thick enough to power a small industrial facility, not a 6-pump fuel station on a forgotten road. One pipe descended through the concrete floor at an angle, suggesting it connected to something well below the level of the fuel storage tanks. Yet it did not appear on any diagram he had found tacked to the wall of the utility closet. The 7th pump column, the one at the far end of the canopy, had no meter housing at all, just a blank panel where the gauge should have been, though its wiring was live. The county records office, when he called to request the full ownership history, informed him that the file for Mile 7 had been misfiled and could not be located at present. He wrote all of it down in a small notebook and told himself there were 100 reasonable explanations. Then he found the initials. He was replacing a main breaker in the master control box, a steel enclosure mounted to the rear wall of the service bay. When his flashlight caught a set of letters scratched into the inside face of the door panel, DB, clean and deliberate, the kind of marking a technician leaves as a quiet signature on work he is proud of. Nolan's father, Dean Briggs, had spent a decade working pipeline and energy system contracts across the desert Southwest before a heart condition forced him to stop, and those were exactly the kinds of initials he left on every job he finished. Nolan stood still in the hot afternoon light for a long moment and told himself that DB could stand for dozens of names, that the desert had seen thousands of maintenance workers over the decades, and that he was pattern matching from grief rather than evidence. He closed the box, finished the wiring, and went back to work. That evening, he started the old diesel generator to test the neon canopy sign, watching it flicker and then hold steady in the growing dark, a stripe of amber light against the flat indigo sky. He did not know that somewhere beneath the concrete on which he stood, a transmitter sealed inside a lead-lined housing had just received enough power to do what it had been waiting nearly 3 decades to do. Nolan first saw the headlights as a single smear of white against the far edge of the desert floor, then a line of them resolving into a disciplined convoy moving at highway speed. He stepped out of the service bay holding a wrench and watched the vehicles pull in with the precision of something rehearsed. 12 black SUVs forming 2 parallel rows around the fuel canopy, engines cutting off in near unison, doors opening to reveal people who moved with the practiced calm of private security professionals. They wore dark suits and none of them spoke to him directly. Then the door of the 6th vehicle opened and a woman stepped out who was obviously the reason all the others were there, walking toward Nolan with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never in her adult life needed to rush because the destination always waited. Sloan Rothwell was 38 years old and had run Rothwell Dominion Energy for 6 years, a position earned through genuine strategic intelligence and the advantage of carrying the name carved above the company's headquarters in Phoenix. She was composed in the way that powerful people practice composure, as a tool rather than a temperament, and she looked at Nolan the way she looked at most new problems, as something that had a solution she simply had not located yet. She asked him, without introduction, who had helped him bring Station 7 back online. Nolan said he did not know what Station 7 was, and that as far as he was concerned, he had turned on a used generator to test a sign. She paused, reading him, and then explained that the property he had purchased had once been held by a Rothwell subsidiary, that it contained a secure installation belonging to her family, and that she had traveled through the night because a signal had activated for the first time in 27 years. The lawyer produced a purchase proposal before Nolan had a chance to ask any of the questions forming rapidly in the back of his mind. The offer was clean and formally presented. $50 million for the full parcel, all structures, and all subterranean rights within the registered boundary. It was the kind of number that is designed to close a conversation rather than start one. And Nolan knew that because he had once watched a corporation offer a group of plant workers a severance package so generous that everyone cried while signing away their rights to sue. He folded the document and asked Sloan a direct question. Why would a multi-billion-dollar energy company pay $50 million for a property that had sold at tax auction for less than $20,000? She said there was a storage facility below the property and that its contents belonged to the Rothwell family. He asked why that facility was not disclosed in the deed. She did not have an answer that satisfied him. Nolan retrieved the purchase documents he had received from the county and read the relevant clause aloud. The property conveyed all fixed improvements above and below grade within the survey boundary, registered public utility infrastructure. No vault, no subterranean annex, no protected enclosure had been declared in the county filing, which meant that legally, and according to every piece of paper he could produce, what was under the ground was his. He told Sloan he would not be signing anything or surrendering access to any part of the property until he understood what he actually owned. She was unaccustomed to being declined in this manner, not with hostility, not with fear, just with the flat pragmatism of a man who had read the document and knew what it said. She instructed her security chief, a large and serious man named Darius Cole, to stand down, and she told Nolan she would remain until they could reach an arrangement, because leaving without resolving the situation was not something she was prepared to do. He let her wait outside while he walked back into the service bay and pressed the heel of his boot against the center of the floor, listening. The concrete returned a sound that was not quite right, not the dull thud of solid material below, but a slight hollow resonance, the signature of a significant open space beneath. The three of them, Nolan, Sloan, and Darius, who had announced himself quietly as her security director, moved through the service bay in the early hours before dawn, with flashlights and methodical attention. The floor was uneven in places that appeared to be wear, but were, on closer examination, intentional irregularities designed to break up the visual geometry of a hidden seam. The heavy steel tool cabinet at the rear of the bay turned out to be bolted to a poured concrete pad that was itself a separate structural element from the main floor, and when Nolan and Darius shifted it aside, they found a section of floor that had been treated to mimic aged concrete, but was actually a panel of steel sheeting over an engineered threshold. There was no visible handle, no keypad, no lock cylinder. The mechanism was something else entirely. Nolan spent 40 minutes with a flashlight and his notebook before he understood what he was looking at. Each of the 7 pump columns outside was fitted with a calibration dial, a small numbered wheel used ostensibly to adjust the flow meter. But the dial positions on 6 of the 7 pumps formed a sequence that corresponded to nothing in any standard fuel distribution specification. They were digits of a combination. The 7th column, the one with no meter housing, served as the actuator. When the combination was set, and the blank panel on column 7 was pressed in a specific pattern, the mechanical linkage beneath the floor disengaged. It was the kind of engineering that a person with deep experience in industrial systems would recognize as elegant, and someone without that background would never even begin to decode. Nolan's hands were steady as he worked the sequence, because the puzzle felt like something made for someone exactly like him. The floor panel opened on a counterweighted hinge, revealing a steel staircase that descended 11 steps into a chamber the size of a modest warehouse, constructed from reinforced concrete and lined with shelving, workbenches, and a ventilation system that was still cycling air in slow measured exchanges despite decades of disuse. The space had been built to last and built to be forgotten, and both of those things had worked exactly as intended. There was no gold, no currency, no weapons. What the vault contained was documentation, physical, durable, tamper-evident documentation of a kind that a very careful and very suspicious man might choose over digital storage specifically because digital records can be altered and paper cannot be quietly edited in the middle of the night. Rolled survey maps of pipeline corridors, reel-to-reel magnetic tape in sealed canisters, a fire-rated safe requiring 2 separate keys, stacks of binders sealed with embossed tape bearing the personal mark of Everett Rothwell, founder of the company that now carried his granddaughter's ambitions into its 32nd year, and on one workbench a physical prototype of a thermal energy storage mechanism unlike anything Nolan had seen in any specification manual, compact, modular, clearly functional, and clearly never released to the public. Sloan moved through the space with the contained shock of a person recognizing a landscape from a story they had always believed was partly mythological. Her grandfather had told her, once, near the end of his life, that he had hidden the truth about the company in a place that could not be hacked, could not be subpoenaed without physical access, and could not be falsified without destroying the original. She had believed him in the abstract, the way one believes a parable. The evidence on the shelves around her suggested he had been entirely literal. She explained to Nolan that Everett had operated on the principle That institutional memory stored digitally was institutional memory that could be revised, and that certain things, the founding agreements, the patent assignments, the compensation commitments, needed to exist in a form that could not be quietly rewritten. Nolan was examining a maintenance log on the workbench when he found it. A laminated service card, the kind technicians attach to equipment after a maintenance visit, clipped to the frame of the main ventilation controller. The signature in the bottom right corner was Dean Briggs, written in his father's particular handwriting, the slightly backward-leaning D, the firm horizontal stroke on the final S, and the date was 26 years before. His father had worked here, had maintained this place, had known it existed, and had never said a single word about it to anyone in his family. Before Nolan could speak, every light in the vault went out. The darkness was total. Then a speaker mounted high on the rear wall crackled with analog static, and out of it came the voice of a dead man, slightly compressed, weathered by tape age but unmistakably deliberate. If this room has been opened, the person who betrayed this company is still inside it. Nolan found the manual power override in the dark by feel. The industrial generator he had brought for the canopy sign was still running 40 feet above them, and within 12 minutes he had rigged a bypass connection that pulled current from the station's surface systems down into the vault's emergency bus. The lights returned, and with them the full weight of what Everett Rothwell had recorded. The message on the tape did not name the traitor directly. Instead, it described a pattern. Someone in senior leadership had been systematically redirecting the intellectual property of a breakthrough energy storage technology, the prototype sitting on the workbench, away from the company's registered patent portfolio and toward a network of private holding entities. Everett had discovered the diversion late, when the transfer structures were already in place, and he had chosen to preserve the evidence rather than confront the perpetrator directly because he believed a direct confrontation would only accelerate the disappearance of the proof. He had left 2 keys to the main safe with 2 different people. One of them was his granddaughter Sloane, entrusted to come when the station signaled. The other had been given to the keeper, a phrase he used without elaboration on the tape, a technician who understood both the physical site and the moral weight of what was stored in it. The maintenance records in the binders confirmed it plainly. Dean Briggs had been the last authorized technician on site, had conducted maintenance visits across a span of 3 years, and had been the individual Everett trusted with both the operational knowledge of the vault and physical custody of the second key. Nolan stood with a binder open in front of him and felt the ground shift in a way that had nothing to do with geology. His father had spent 3 years in this desert, maintaining a hidden room full of evidence against powerful people, and had chosen silence over safety for reasons that the family had never been given. He thought about the metal box his father had kept on the shelf in his workshop, always locked, never explained, gone after the funeral in the confusion of estate settlement and hurried moves. Sloane asked, carefully but directly, whether Nolan had known about this when he purchased the property. Her tone was not aggressive, but it was searching, and the implication was clear. Nolan told her that he had driven to a county auction looking for a cheap piece of desert to start over in, and that until 40 minutes ago he had thought the DB on the breaker panel might be a coincidence. The tension between them hardened. Sloane was a person trained to assess leverage in conversations and the situation she was standing in. A man whose father had held the second key now owning the property was almost too convenient to accept as accidental. Nolan understood her suspicion and found it offensive not because it was unreasonable, but because he was already grieving, quietly, the realization that his father had carried something enormous alone. Naomi Weller had been Nolan's attorney for the purchase, a practical, unimpressed woman in Red Mesa who knew Nevada land law the way a carpenter knows wood grain and when he called her at 6 in the morning, she did not sound surprised that something complicated had emerged. She began running searches while they spoke and called back within the hour. A limited liability company registered to a financial trust associated with the name Malcolm Prescott had filed 3 separate purchase offers for the Mile 7 parcel over the preceding 5 years. Each offer had been withdrawn. The pattern was not the behavior of a disinterested investor. It was the behavior of someone waiting for the right moment and growing impatient when it never came. Sloane was quiet when Nolan read her the name. Malcolm Prescott was her executive vice president, the man who had served as the company's senior operational authority since before she had taken the chief executive role, the man her grandfather had brought in from a finance family in Connecticut, and trusted with the internal machinery of Rothwell Dominion Energy for nearly 2 decades. Sloane stepped away and called Malcolm directly. She asked him what he knew about Station 7. His voice, when he responded, carried the particular quality of a man performing surprise. Measured, calibrated, just surprised enough. He told her she needed to come back to Phoenix, that the site was unstable, that she should let the legal team handle the acquisition. She hung up and stood in the cool morning air outside the service bay without speaking. 3 minutes later, Nolan's phone lit up with a notification forwarded from the county environmental office. The Mile 7 parcel had been flagged for emergency inspection due to a reported hazardous material seepage. The report had been filed 90 seconds after Sloane's call to Malcolm ended. By 8 in the morning, the desert highway that had been empty for days carried a small traffic jam. A state environmental inspector in a white truck, 2 attorneys from a firm based in Phoenix, a county code officer, and a vehicle with no identifying markings that no one would explain. They deployed at the property line, and the lead attorney handed Nolan a notice requiring him to vacate the premises pending completion of a site assessment, citing state statutes covering potential groundwater contamination. Naomi arrived within 40 minutes and examined the documentation. The inspection order had been signed and issued in under 2 hours, a timeline, she told Nolan flatly, that bore no relationship to the standard processing period for such requests, which was measured in weeks. Someone had a direct line to the regulatory process, and that line led away from the public interest and toward a private one. Sloane had the resources to deploy her own legal team against the process in a matter of hours. She made 2 calls and then stopped, holding the phone against her palm, and for a moment, Nolan watched her weigh something that had nothing to do with strategy. She was calculating whether to publicly oppose Malcolm before she had enough evidence to guarantee the outcome, knowing that a failed challenge would leave her exposed and him in control of the board narrative. He could see her making the calculus, and he kept his expression neutral because he had watched this kind of calculation before. In boardrooms that smelled like carpet cleaner, in severance meetings where the decision had already been made before the workers sat down, and he had learned that expressing his contempt only accelerated the conclusion. Sloane made the calls. The Rothwell legal team filed a procedural challenge arguing improper process and insufficient basis, which stopped the clock on the eviction notice and bought time that Naomi estimated at between 2 and 4 days, depending on how aggressively the other side pushed back. Malcolm called Nolan's cell number at midday, and the fact that he had it at all was the first thing Nolan noted. The conversation was brief and courteous in the way that a blade wrapped in cloth is still a blade. Malcolm said he understood Nolan was a practical man, that $100 million was a number no reasonable person would decline, that a single father with a 13-year-old daughter and no institutional support structure ought to recognize when a situation was above his capacity to manage. He added that all of Nolan's existing financial obligations would be retired as part of the transaction, which was the moment Nolan understood that Malcolm had been researching him. Nolan asked him why he was offering double what his employer had offered for the same property. Malcolm said that a man in Nolan's position should know when to stop asking questions. Nolan told him he would think about it, ended the call, and immediately checked Nevada's one-party recording consent statute, which confirmed that he had been within his legal rights to capture the conversation on a second device that had been running since the call connected. Darius had been moving in the background of the situation with the quiet efficiency of a man conducting a private inquiry he had not been assigned. He had been Sloan's security director for 4 years, and he had access to the company's internal security architecture. The server logs, the remote access records, the audit trails of who had used what credential to send what command from which location. What he found was not ambiguous. The lockdown command that had cut power to the vault the night before had been transmitted from a device registered to Malcolm Prescott's office security account at a time when Malcolm's own calendar showed him at a dinner engagement in Scottsdale. Someone had used the credential remotely, which meant Malcolm either did it himself or had authorized another person to monitor the situation and act on his behalf. Darius shared the logs with Sloan without expression and waited while she read them twice. Mara called that evening, and Nolan spent 4 minutes telling her nothing about the specifics and everything about the fact that things were complicated but under control. She was 13 and perceptive, and she told him not to sell anything just because someone was trying to make him afraid. He sent her to stay with her aunt in Reno that same night, not because there was danger in any immediate sense, but because a desert gas station had become the center of a corporate dispute, and that was no place for a child to spend a school week. Naomi called an hour later. She had found a reference in an archived legal index suggesting the deed for Mile 7 had once included a recorded addendum, a rider document attached at the time of original Rothwell subsidiary transfer, and that document no longer existed in the county file. A page had been physically removed from the official record. The archived copy surfaced the following morning in a box of old permit applications at the regional newspaper's morgue, where a part-time archivist had been digitizing paper records for a county preservation project. The rider document was 4 pages, and the first page confirmed what the vault's physical contents had already suggested. Mile 7 was not merely a fuel station on an abandoned highway. The parcel sat at the precise geographic midpoint of a corridor connecting 2 desert basins that Rothwell Dominion Energy had quietly assembled rights-of-way across over a period of 12 years, and that corridor was the planned route of an $8 billion energy storage infrastructure project that the company intended to announce within the next 18 months. Without access to the Mile 7 parcel, the corridor broke in half, and the project became logistically unworkable, without a property acquisition that could take years of litigation to complete. The second page detailed the technology. The prototype in the vault represented the foundational patent of the thermal storage system Rothwell intended to license as the operational core of the corridor project. The rider specified that any commercial application of that technology required a revenue-sharing structure that directed defined percentages to 3 designated recipients: a retirement fund for Rothwell's hourly workforce, a community infrastructure pool serving the towns along the pipeline corridor, and the legally designated custodian of the Mile 7 documentation, or the custodian's surviving heirs. Malcolm had removed the rider from the county file, Naomi believed, because its existence complicated the transfer of patent rights to the holding entities he controlled. Entities that would receive the full licensing value of the technology if the rider's terms were never enforced. The workers' fund, the community pool, the custodian's rights, all of it would simply vanish if no one knew to claim it. Nolan sat with the rider document for a long time. He had bought this property for $17,400 at a tax auction, and the number 50 million had felt like a hallucination when the briefcase opened. He understood now that the 50 million had never been about the gas station. It had been about purchasing silence at a price calculated to feel incomprehensible to someone in his circumstances. And in the purchase would come the transfer of patent rights, the elimination of the rider obligations, and the burial of everything Dean Briggs had protected for 26 years. If he had signed anything in the first 20 minutes of that first conversation, he would have done it without ever knowing what he was signing away. He found Sloane standing outside by the fuel canopy and told her everything the rider contained in plain language. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said she had known about the $8 billion project, but had been given documentation by Malcolm suggesting the land rights were clean. She had not examined the title history herself, because she had trusted the summary. Her voice, as she said, it was flat in the way that indicates a person processing shame rather than defending against it. She asked whether he had considered that going public could destabilize the company and affect thousands of employees who had nothing to do with what Malcolm had done. Nolan asked whether she wanted to preserve the company by concealing the theft from its own workforce or by excising the part that was rotting. She did not answer him then. He walked back into the service bay and began examining pump column 7 from the base. Behind the blank panel, in a small cavity he had to reach for with 2 fingers, he found a photograph, his father and a white-haired man in work clothes, standing in front of the station canopy, squinting into desert sun, both of them grinning. On the reverse, in handwriting that was neither his father's nor anyone's he recognized, were the words, "The key is not in the box. It is in the thing that always brought you home." Dean Briggs had driven a 1978 Ford pickup throughout Nolan's childhood, a truck the color of old clay, with a cracked dashboard compass and a gear shift that required a particular wrist motion to find third. Nolan had learned to drive in that truck. After Dean died, it had sat in the driveway for a season before the family, overwhelmed with the practical weight of settling an estate and preparing a move, had donated it to a salvage yard outside Henderson. Nolan remembered the yard. He remembered the owner's name because Dean had bought parts there and the man had attended the funeral. It was a thin thread, but it was there. The truck had not been crushed. A collector in the town of Mineral Springs, 40 minutes from Mile 7, had purchased it from the salvage yard 8 years earlier as a restoration project that stalled at disassembly, and he cataloged every vehicle he owned by VIN and could confirm its location within 30 seconds. Nolan and Sloane drove there in the morning with little conversation. The desert outside was turning gold in the early light, and the silence between them had shifted from mutual suspicion to something quieter and less defined. The interior of the truck was dusty and faded, the vinyl cracked along the seams. The rearview mirror was still in place, an aftermarket unit Dean had installed himself, oversized for better sight lines on highway drives. Nolan unscrewed the mounting bracket and found, taped to the back face of the mirror housing, with a strip of electrical tape that had gone stiff with age, a small brass key and a cassette tape sealed inside a plastic sleeve. The key was cut for the Rothwell safe in the vault below Mile 7. The tape was 45 minutes of Dean Briggs, speaking quietly and precisely into a handheld recorder, accounting for everything he knew. His father's voice, preserved on magnetic tape for more than 2 decades, described a discovery Dean had made during his 3rd year maintaining the station. He had found evidence that funds designated for the workers' retirement accounts were being transferred to a structure that bore no relationship to any fund the employees had been told existed, and he had brought the concern to Everett directly. Everett had shown him documentation confirming the diversion traced to forged internal approvals linked to Malcolm Prescott, but had not gone to the authorities because the records in the vault were the only foundational proof. He had asked Dean to hold the second key because Dean was a man without corporate ambition, the last person anyone would search, and Dean had agreed and kept it for the rest of his life, writing in the recording that he was leaving it for Nolan when the time came. Sloane received the call from her board while Nolan was still listening to the tape in the truck cab. Her executive authority had been suspended pending a governance review, the notification read, citing improper use of company resources in connection with an unsanctioned property dispute. The motion had been filed by Malcolm and seconded by 2 board members who had been on the company's compensation committee for the past decade. Malcolm had sent her a separate message offering to restore her position if she returned to Phoenix, delivered a formal statement that Nolan had been attempting to extort the company, and surrendered the vault access entirely. It was a clean trap. Accept it and betray the truth, refuse it and lose everything her family had built. She sat in the passenger seat of Nolan's truck in the dusty barn in Mineral Springs for a long moment, and Nolan let the silence hold without pressing her. Then she asked him for a copy of every document in the vault, everything, the full record. She said he had the right to publish whatever he found, and that if doing so cost her the company, she was going to lose it fighting for the right thing rather than keep it by surrendering to the wrong one. It was the first time since she had stepped out of that black SUV 4 nights earlier that Nolan heard her speak without the particular careful architecture of a person managing her position. He looked at her for a moment and said they should get back to the vault before dark. They opened the safe in the vault with both keys, turning them simultaneously the way the mechanism required, and the door swung open on a chamber inside a chamber. The patent filings in their original executed form, the founding compensation agreements with their revenue-sharing schedules, ledgers showing the movement of retirement funds across a 12-year period and the structures those funds had moved into, and a final sealed envelope addressed in Everett Rothwell's handwriting to "My granddaughter, when she is ready to own it honestly." Inside was a letter that Sloane read standing in the fluorescent light of the vault with tears running quietly down her face, and she did not explain its contents, and Nolan did not ask. He turned away and examined the prototype on the workbench instead, reading the technical specifications in the documentation beside it, and found himself thinking that his father had spent years protecting a machine that could change how power reached remote places. And that was a thing worth protecting. The last page of the patent filing contained a provision he had not expected. Everett had assigned stewardship rights over the technology to an independent trust outside the Rothwell corporate structure entirely, and had named a living custodian as trustee, the role that automatically transferred to the next of kin of the designated keeper upon that keeper's death. Dean Briggs had been the designated keeper, which meant that Nolan was the trustee. The power of the trustee role was not absolute, and Nolan understood that clearly before anyone else tried to define it for him. He could not dissolve Rothwell, could not direct its operations, could not redirect its revenues. What he could do was control whether the patented technology was licensed at all, to whom and under what conditions, which meant he had the ability to stop the $8 billion corridor project in its tracks, to license the technology to a competitor instead, to demand restoration of the workers' fund as a precondition of any license agreement, and to nullify every contract Malcolm's shell companies had signed to receive royalty income from a patent they had never legitimately held. That combination of authorities made him, in practical terms, the single most consequential person in any negotiation about the future of Rothwell Dominion Energy's most valuable asset. Malcolm arrived at Mile 7 the following morning with a legal team, a demolition crew, and an emergency court order declaring the underground structure an imminent public safety hazard. He stepped out of his car looking precisely as controlled as he always did. Pressed suit, measured gait, the demeanor of a man who had never in his professional life walked into a room he did not already command. He offered Nolan $100 million and told him it would be deposited before the end of business that day. He added, almost as an afterthought, that Sloane's reinstatement as chief executive was fully within his ability to arrange, and that the two of them, Nolan and Sloane together, had constructed a situation that was only going to damage everyone the longer it persisted. Nolan listened to all of it without changing his expression and then asked Naomi, who was standing at his left elbow, what the fastest path to a temporary restraining order on the demolition crew looked like. The answer was a filing arguing irreparable destruction of evidence in an active fraud matter, supported by the recorded call in which Malcolm had suggested a single father ought to know when to stop asking questions, and by Darius's server logs linking Malcolm's credential to the Vault lockdown command. The filing went to a federal magistrate because the patent trust gave the matter interstate commercial standing, and the magistrate issued a 48-hour standstill within 3 hours. The demolition crew loaded back into their vehicles and left the road quiet. Malcolm stood in the lot and looked at Nolan with an expression that was no longer the controlled thing it had been, and Nolan met it without hostility and without performance, because he had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Sloane spent the standstill period preparing. She contacted every board member individually, sent documentation packages to each of them, and requested an emergency shareholder session. Malcolm filed an injunction to block the meeting on the grounds that Sloane had been suspended. The injunction was denied because Sloane was acting as a shareholder, not as chief executive, and shareholders could call meetings regardless of management status. She chose to hold the session at Mile 7, in the open air under the canopy, because there was no conference room in a corporate tower that would serve as well as the place where the evidence actually was. The vehicles came again in the desert dark, but differently this time. There were 11 of them, board members, independent legal counsel, representatives of the Workers' Fund that had believed for a decade that their retirement contributions were simply growing slowly, financial investigators who had been quietly briefed by Darius in the preceding 24 hours, and 2 people from the regulatory body that oversaw energy sector patent registrations. They arrived in a scattered procession rather than a formation, pulling into the station in 1s and 2s over the course of half an hour, their headlights sweeping the canopy sign that still read Mile 7 in amber neon against the cold desert night. Sloane opened the meeting with the kind of candor that costs something. She told the assembled board that she had relied on summaries rather than source documents, that she had permitted a concentration of operational authority in one person because doing so was efficient, and because she had trusted the wrong man's competence over her own instinct to verify. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not offer excuses. She accepted that her tenure had included a failure of oversight that a chief executive had a fundamental obligation to prevent, and she told them she was present to correct it rather than defend it. Then she stepped back and Nolan presented the evidence. He had spent the night organizing it in a sequence that moved from document to document without rhetoric, the rider agreement that had been physically removed from the county file, and its recovered archive copy showing the revenue-sharing obligations, the patent assignment records with the shell company transfer signatures dated 3 years before Sloane took the chief executive role, the ledger entries showing retirement fund outflows across a 12-year window, and the corresponding inflows to entities registered to Malcolm's financial trust, Darius's access logs linking Malcolm's security credential to the Vault lockdown, the recorded phone call in which Malcolm had offered Nolan the equivalent of a bribe while implying that a single father ought to recognize when a situation was over his head. The board listened without interruption. One of the fund representatives asked a single clarifying question about the transfer routing structure and then went quiet. Malcolm spoke when the evidence presentation ended. He said that Dean Briggs had been a disgruntled contract worker who had accessed secure facilities without authorization and had removed documents illegally. He said Nolan was his son and therefore had a personal motive to fabricate a narrative that painted Rothwell's senior management in the worst possible light. He said Sloan had manufactured a crisis to recapture board authority she had lost on merit. His voice was measured, and his argument was coherent, and it disintegrated the moment the board's independent legal counsel pointed out that the maintenance access logs from the Rothwell system showed Dean Briggs had held a formally authorized technician credential for the Mile 7 site, signed and renewed by Everett Rothwell himself, for the entire duration of his service there. A man authorized to be in a place is not a trespasser in it. The counter-narrative collapsed on its own weight, the way structures do when the load-bearing element is removed. The board voted to suspend Malcolm's authority and request his immediate removal from the premises, pending a full investigation by the Financial Oversight Authority. No one raised their voice. No security personnel were involved. Malcolm walked to his car, and the car drove away into the desert, and that was the end of it in every way that mattered in that room. Sloan was offered reinstatement to the chief executive role subject to her accepting a mandate to restructure the company's governance and restore the workers' fund in full with interest. She accepted both conditions without negotiating either. After the board members and investigators had departed in their scattered procession, Sloan found Nolan sitting on the concrete lip of the canopy apron, drinking cold coffee from a thermos. She asked him what he intended to do with the trustee authority over the patent. He looked at the desert for a long moment before answering. He told her he had no interest in selling an old secret to a new owner. What he wanted, he said, was to build something that actually worked. 6 months later, the property at the edge of the Nevada desert no longer looked like a gas station that time had abandoned. The old canopy was repainted and structurally reinforced. The service bay had been expanded into a working technical facility. 2 new buildings had gone up beside the original structure, modest, functional, constructed from materials suited to a desert climate. A small sign near the entrance read Briggs 7 Energy Research and Development, and below it, in smaller letters, a designation, Independent Affiliate, Rothwell Dominion Energy Infrastructure Project. Nolan had retained full ownership of the land and structured the relationship with Rothwell through a licensing agreement that his attorney had helped him draft over the course of 3 weeks and 9 drafts. The terms were specific and enforceable. Nolan controlled the technology and its application. Rothwell had first right of participation as an investor at defined contribution levels. The Workers' Fund received a contractually guaranteed percentage of all licensing revenue. The towns along the corridor received priority access to energy storage capacity at below market rates, and every patent filed through Briggs 7 would carry the correct names of the people who had done the work. The vault beneath the station remained sealed, its contents transferred to a certified legal repository. Its existence now a matter of public record in the county filing that had been corrected and resubmitted with the missing rider document reattached. Sloan had restructured the executive team and brought in an independent audit that would run for 2 years. She had also done something quieter. She had personally contacted each member of the Workers' Fund to explain what had happened, what had been taken, and what was being returned. The calls had been long, and not all of them had gone smoothly, and she had not asked anyone to forgive the company, only to allow the process of correction to be completed. She drove to Mile 7 regularly, usually in a mid-sized personal vehicle without a security detail, because she had found that the desert highway had a specific quality of solitude that was useful for thinking without the usual apparatus of corporate life surrounding her thoughts. On the day of the official opening, Mara drove out from Reno with her aunt and hung the restored Mile 7 sign back under the canopy where it had always been, using the same mounting brackets Dean Briggs had installed decades before. She stood on a stepladder and made small adjustments until the sign was level, then climbed down and stood beside her father and looked at it in the afternoon light. Nolan pointed out the room inside the main building where a framed photograph of Dean Briggs hung above a small mounted plaque reading Chief Technical Custodian, Mile 7 Site, and Mara stood in front of it for a long time and did not say anything, which meant she understood. The work was not glamorous in the way that a corporate announcement is glamorous. Nolan spent most of his days in the technical facility, running tests on successive versions of the thermal storage prototype, hiring engineers from universities and from the practical world of industrial systems maintenance, solving problems that were real and measurable. He still serviced stranded vehicles when they appeared on the old highway, because the highway was still out there and the desert was still capable of stopping an engine without warning, and because a man with a generator, a set of tools, and the willingness to show up was worth more in that stretch of land than the most sophisticated energy model ever designed in a Phoenix conference room. He made coffee every morning in the original station kitchen. He kept the generator maintained. The relationship between Nolan and Sloan developed in the unhurried way that relationships do when both people have reason to trust carefully. She did not arrive with gifts or overtures or the weight of her position deployed as a means of entry. He did not treat her as a symbol of everything he had spent years resenting about the distance between capital and labor. They had been through something specific together, had watched each other make decisions under pressure, and what remained after the pressure lifted was a kind of credible knowledge of each other that most people never acquire at all. One evening in the autumn, Sloan drove out to the station alone and arrived as the last light was leaving the sky. Nolan was closing up the technical facility. She asked if he had time for dinner. He looked down the highway, the road where 12 black SUVs had materialized out of nothing on a midnight that had changed everything. And he thought about how quickly a man's understanding of his own life can be revised by a single night's evidence. He told her that he was free, but only if she was coming as herself this time, and not as a representative of anything. She said the only thing she had brought with her was an empty seat at whatever table he chose. The Mile 7 sign came on above them as the dark settled in, amber light holding steady against the enormous desert sky. The same light that had reached up into the night when a dead transmitter woke and sent its message out. The same light that had drawn 12 black cars out of the horizon on the first night Nolan Briggs ever slept in the desert he had decided to call home. If you believe that a forgotten place can still hold a truth worth fighting for, stay with Nolan until the very last mile.
The fight will definitely get you overwhelmed, so try to stay. Calm, don't overuse your abilities, or you're gonna lose. It's fair advice. Let me go grab my food. Be right back.